Welcome to lecture number 50. The topic is 5.8, Military Conflict in the Civil War. The theme is America in the World. The learning objective is explain the various factors that contributed to the Union victory in the Civil War. The first learning objective says, both the Union and the Confederacy mobilized their economies and societies to wage the war even while facing considerable home front opposition. Both governments devoted all of their resources and all of their efforts to fighting the war. The Northern economy had more advantages. The Union controlled all financial industries, 85% of the factories were in the North, 70% of railroads were in the North, and they had 65% of the farmland, most of which produced food that fed the country through the war, as opposed to the farmland in the South that was used to grow cash crops. The Union, thus, could maintain this war effort for longer than the South could. The railroads were key as the armies were larger and needed transportation to the front lines, often in remote areas. The Southern railroad lines were more spread out. There weren't as many of them, and they didn't all use a standard gauge. That means that the width of the rail lines was different on some tracks than others, which required troops to get off one train and transfer onto another with the appropriate gauge. The Confederacy was hoping for outside financial help from Britain from the beginning of the war, as they were the main trading partner for Southern cotton. When the Southern ports were blocked by the Union Navy, the Confederacy begins to print paper money to pay for war supplies, which led to huge inflation and hurt their economy. Since the Confederacy was hoping to finance the war on their cotton exports, and they were quickly unable to export any, they experienced a quick economic collapse. The North had all the pieces to create an industrial war machine. The South did not. There were some societal differences that gave the Union an advantage. They had almost 4 times the amount of free population in the North than they did in the South, about 5.5 million in the South and over 20 million in the North. The larger population made it easier to field an army. In the 18th and 19th century, a standing army was considered a threat to the Republic. So any time that a war started, troops would be recruited and most would be sent home at the conclusion of the war. That was the case after the last major conflict, the Mexican-American War. The U.S. Army soldiers that continued to serve after the war were stationed in forts across the country, but they did not make up a considerable fighting force. After Fort Sumter, Lincoln successfully raises a force of 75,000 by calling on the states to send volunteers. It was the largest fighting force ever assembled and still did not constitute more than 1% of the total Northern population. The South further hampered itself in raising necessary troops by instituting what was called the 20 Negro Law. It exempted any white man from military service who owned a plantation with more than 20 enslaved people on the plantation. Historians have described the Civil War in the Confederacy as a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight. Those who would benefit the most from the result of the war were the ones who were exempt from fighting, while those who were fighting for a country that allowed slavery most often weren't enslavers themselves. In addition, the Union already had a navy and warships. The Confederacy didn't have the materials or resources to build one in such a short amount of time. The Confederacy tried to purchase ships from Britain, but the sale was blocked when the Union found out about it. The best they could do was repair old Union Navy ships that were left in southern ports. Its disadvantage at sea allowed the Union to easily carry out a blockade of all southern ports. The Confederacy had also deliberately created a weak central government, very much like the Articles of Confederation in the 1780s. Even if the resources were present, their central government was less able to direct the states on how to carry on the war. Both the Union and the Confederacy dealt with opposition to war measures by civilians. The southern states were angry at what they saw as government overreach in the use of a draft and suspension of habeas corpus. Even the Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, sours with the Davis administration. He speaks out openly against Davis in the Georgia legislature and pushes to negotiate a peace while the Confederacy was still winning battles. As the economy got worse in the Confederacy, the capital city of the Confederacy, Richmond, Virginia, is rocked by bread riots. Inflation made it difficult to buy foodstuffs, while food crops were being used to feed Confederate troops. Women were the main participants and broke into shops, looted, and confronted Jefferson Davis. Davis didn't have much in the way of an answer or solution. He pleaded with them to go back to their homes and gave them whatever money he had on him. Eventually, the city militia is raised and threatens to put down the riot by violent means, at which point the women disperse. The Union was not immune from discontent by civilians either. In states like Maryland, Abraham Lincoln imposed martial law to keep the borders as part of the Union. In New York City, draft riots are carried out as the Union implemented a conscription law to replenish its troops. The Union draft, like the Confederate one, created exemptions for wealthy men. The price in the Union was $300 to pay for a replacement, something the rioters, who were mostly Irish-American wage workers, could not feasibly afford. The riot turned into a race riot as they viewed African Americans as the cause for the war. They attacked black Americans on the streets, destroyed black neighborhoods, and even burnt down an orphanage. The rioters were eventually quelled, but the riot resulted in Black New Yorkers moving out of Manhattan and into Brooklyn, shifting demographics for future generations. There's one more key concept in this lecture, but it's broken up into two parts. The first says the Confederacy showed military initiative and daring early in the war, though the Union ultimately succeeded. The early parts of the war looked very hopeful for the Confederacy. The Battle of Fort Sumter was an initial Confederate victory. The next major battle, the Battle of Bull Run, just outside of Washington, D.C., Union troops are defeated. It highlighted the inexperience of the Union troops as they lost their nerve in the chaotic fighting. After the initial defeat, the Union General George McClellan attempts an innovative military maneuver that the United States had used in the Mexican-American War, an amphibious attack. McClellan put all of his troops on boats and sailed them to southeastern Virginia to take Richmond from the rear. It fails miserably because his troop movements were too slow and the Confederate troops had enough time to mount a defense. The general of the Confederate forces, Joseph Johnston, is wounded in the fighting and as a result is replaced by Robert E. Lee. A second Battle of Bull Run happens shortly after with a similar result. The Union general, John Pope, is in charge and marches his troops into an ambush. Pope is relieved of his command and his troops are merged with the larger Army of the Potomac led by McClellan. It's not until Antietam that the Union gets some semblance of a victory. McClellan happens upon information on the Confederates' position. McClellan has every advantage imaginable, more troops, more weapons, and the element of surprise. However, he is timid in the number of troops he commits to the attack, and it becomes the bloodiest single day of the war. As the Confederate commander, General Robert E. Lee, starts his retreat, General McClellan does not pursue him. He cites insufficient forces and not wanting to stretch out his forces too thinly. When Abraham Lincoln finds out, he relieves General McClellan of his command and ends his military career. Antietam is important because it's what President Lincoln will use as his platform for issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. Attempts at gaining British recognition were promising at first for the Confederacy. The Trent Affair refers to an incident in which two Confederate diplomats were on their way to Great Britain to seek diplomatic recognition. Union Navy ships intercepted the Trent, a British ship, and took the two Confederate diplomats off of the ship and imprisoned them. Great Britain was really angry about this because it was seen as an offense on the sovereignty and neutrality rights of Great Britain. According to international naval law, it was as if the diplomats had been kidnapped in England. After Britain and the Confederacy raised a fuss, Abraham Lincoln released the diplomats to the Confederacy. The Confederacy had to start from scratch in building its army and definitely its navy. They tried to purchase British warships and commercial raiders that would also strain the Union's relationship with Great Britain. The ships were critical for the war effort because the Union blockade had been greatly effective at limiting cotton exports, crippling the Confederate ability to buy war materials. Another of the ways in which the Confederacy tried to build up its navy was by using the old U.S. ships that were in the South. At the time of secession, one such ship was the USS Merrimack. It was repurposed into the CSS Virginia. They outfitted it with iron sidings and turned it into an ironclad. As soon as it was operational, it began to compromise the Union blockade. It was just a stronger ship as a result of its reinforced sides. The U.S. Navy sent reinforcements in the form of the USS Monitor. This naval fight between the Monitor and the Merrimack, or the CSS Virginia, at Hampton Roads, Virginia, is seen as the highlight of the naval warfare between the two sides. It ended as a stalemate, but it shows that there was a new age in naval warfare and naval technology. Britain would also eventually find other sources for cotton, so they refrained from helping the pro-slavery Confederacy. The second part of the key concept says the Union ultimately succeeded due to improvements in leadership and strategy, key victories, greater resources, and the wartime destruction of the South's infrastructure. The main strategy of the war, developed by General Winfield Scott, was the Anaconda Plan. It started with a U.S. blockade of the entire southern coast, then a squeezing of the Confederacy by dividing it into different points. The U.S. Army needed to control the Mississippi to successfully carry out the war strategy. It would take away Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas as places where the Confederacy could get food and supplies. Once that was controlled, then divide it further in half, separating the Upper South from the Deep South. McClellan was replaced by Ambrose Burnside, and after the Battle of Fredericksburg, Burnside has replaced himself. Meanwhile, General Ulysses S. Grant is gaining prominence in the western theater of the war. He captures Fort Henry, Fort Donelson, the city of Vicksburg in Mississippi, and solidifies the Union control of the Mississippi River. At the same time that Ulysses Grant was victorious at Vicksburg, the Battle of Gettysburg was going on in Pennsylvania. It was the last attempt by the Confederacy of making a northern offensive. Robert E. Lee thought that if they had a victory in the Northern Territory, that it would be enough to get Great Britain to recognize that the Confederacy was a viable ally and create opposition for the war in the North. However, Gettysburg was a Union victory as General Meade leads a successful defense of the Confederate offensive. After the siege at Vicksburg and the Battle of Gettysburg, Grant is given the command of the Army of the Potomac, the main Union force in the eastern United States. He is tasked with the pursuit and defeat of General Lee. In the West, he leaves General William Sherman in charge of the Western campaigns to divide the Confederacy through Georgia. Sherman starts in Atlanta and marches to the coastal city of Savannah. Thus, his campaign is called Sherman's March to the Sea. He leads a scorched earth campaign, which means that everything that they march through is to be destroyed. They destroy all of the southern infrastructure, especially the railroad tracks. Sherman's men took out the railroad rails and ties and burnt them to bend the metal, yielding them unusable. Richmond, Virginia, the Confederate capital, is captured on April 3, 1865. General Lee retreats and Grant finally catches him at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. On April 9th, they meet to sign the surrender of the Confederacy. At this meeting, all of the Confederate generals were wearing the very best uniform because they had to throw out all of their clothes to travel as light as they could, so they ended up changing into their cleanest and nicest uniforms. Meanwhile, the Union Army, which had been working double time to catch up to them, looked pretty ragged and dirty. Grant tells Lee to send all of his men home, leave their weapons, but they could take their horses. And that was the end of the Civil War. Finally, for the recap. The Union and Confederacy mobilized as quickly as they could to fight the war, often silencing dissent. The Confederacy showed early signs of success due to poor strategy and fighting from Union troops. Naval warfare begins to be transformed during the Civil War. The Union starts to place effective generals in charge, repel Confederate offensives at Gettysburg, and turns the tide of the war. Sherman's march to the sea compromised the Confederacy's ability to continue fighting, and Lee surrenders to Grant on April 9, 1865. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, you can click on the video link on the screen, and if you're looking for more practice to help you on the AP exam, you can visit apushlights.com. I wish you the very best in all of your studying and look forward to seeing you back on the next lecture.